Welcome to the Eureka Centre for Dark Tourism and Darker Histories, a Ballarat Heritage Festival event presented by the Eureka Centre. So today we'll discuss the growing popularity of dark tourism. And I'm stepping in as chair because unfortunately Professor David Waldron has come down with COVID. So this is, David's the second chair we've lost in the last week, unfortunately. But I'm very thankful that David shared his notes with me and his questions, so I'll be chairing today's panel discussion. And I'd like to begin by introducing our panellists closest to me, beginning with Bonnie Chu, a Wadawurrung traditional owner and director of Mirryu Cultural Consulting. Tara Calaby in the middle, PhD candidate at LaTrobe University, Melbourne, who is researching the social worlds of women in Victoria's lunatic asylums between 1860 and 1914, and Nathaniel Buchanan, the Managing Director of Eeries Tours. And I was joking before that Nathaniel's the villain in the piece today because not only is he dressed in black to play that part, he will be defending dark tourism, because although a lot of people might have a perception that dark tourism is a negative thing, we certainly know that dark tourism also contributes significantly to the well-being of institutions through providing funding and engaging new audiences. So it's going to be a really dynamic conversation. We've got three really interesting people with us today. So I'll just give a little introduction about dark tourism, just so that you've got a sense of what we're talking about if you haven't heard that term before. Established histories have romanticised the Victorian gold rush, obscuring the stories of the marginalised and notably omitting the displacement and dispossession of Indigenous peoples. In recent years, sites of death and tragedy have become a popular focus for dark tourism. Dark tourism can be seen as exploitative and unethical, or alternatively as claiming space for marginalised histories in public discourse. This panel discussion will consider the problematic histories of such sites and the challenges and opportunities that dark tourism brings to heritage management and interpretation. And I'd also like to share some words from David Waldron. And David writes, "From the institutional corridors of the former Arrowdale Mental Hospital in Ararat to the attraction of Old Melbourne Jail and the horrors of convict life displayed at Port Arthur, sites of trauma have long held a unique attraction for tourism. They reveal a deep fascination for the macabre, the forbidden and the taboo. On the one hand, they are often the only means by which recollections of problematic and difficult histories are remembered, yet they also transform those stories into vicarious thrills for the tourist interested in tales of gore, violation and sexual taboo, instead of the tragedies they represent. At the same time, these sites of conscience also require funds for their maintenance and preservation. To help you frame your thinking about dark history, I thought I'd share some of my experiences with reference to three of the places that David mentioned. Now, probably one of the most horrific experiences I can recall as a child is visiting the Old Melbourne Jail and seeing the gallows. I probably was in grade 3 or 4 or something. It feels quite extraordinary now that it really did have an impact, and I'm sure that bringing school groups in now might be a little bit more tempered. But the seeds of a dark tourism experience certainly lies in that experience for me. And of course, now that the Old Melbourne Jail, one of its most popular programs is the Hangman's Tour and ghost tours as well. So that's been an area of growth for that attraction over many years. Arrowdale Mental Hospital, the first time I ever heard the term dark tourism, I was working for Ararat Council, and there was a lot of hope that dark tourism could grow the numbers at both Arrowdale and J Ward, the prison for the criminally insane. I had no idea what dark tourism is, and of course Nathaniel can talk about his experience delivering those sorts of dark tourism experiences. But I later found out that I had a direct descendant who died in Arrowdale. So from feeling really ambivalent about dark tourism, I now have a personal connection. So what does that mean for us, where we might go along and enjoy a ghost tour, but we know that there are other people there that really have a profound personal connection to that site, and maybe it's a really unsettling experience for them to know that you're there enjoying maybe a form of entertainment. Port Arthur, David talked about Port Arthur, obviously a really significant colonial site in Australia, a major attraction, also with some dark tourism programming around the convict aspect of that experience. But we also know that there was a terrible massacre that occurred there in recent times. And although there's some interpretation at the site around there, we're a long way from turning that into a dark tourism experience. I would imagine it's probably never going to happen. So perhaps we can begin by talking about time, and certainly time is an important issue for First Nations people as they grapple with their histories of genocide and dispossession. And I want to begin the discussion by putting the question to Bonnie about that notion of time, because certainly Western notions of time might be, okay, 100 years is enough to be able to talk about, a macabre situation or the terrible violent experiences people had in a mental institution. But what notions of time relate to First Nations experience? So Bonnie, if you could begin the discussion by responding to that.
Yeah, thank you. Nida wadin nadiak Bonnie, Wadawurrung afternook. Hello, my name is Bonnie and we are on Wadawurrung country. So thank you for having me here today. Thank you for having such wonderful panel members as well. And really, the dark history is not something that I've looked into before, although I've probably taken part over the years, the old Melbourne jail and grade 6 camp and many other places. I guess from an Indigenous point of view, it's very difficult for people to see these things because they weren't recorded all the time. So one book that we do refer to in Western Victoria is Scars in the Landscape. It's Ian Clark that wrote this book. So it's a registration of those murders or massacres that did happen, but there were many, many more thousands of these sites that we're still wanting to have a look into. It's probably not something we would do some dark tourism on. We probably want some truth telling. So there's a commission that's just come out from the treaty process that's happening here in Victoria called the Eureka. And it's actually a Royal Commission, a very independent one of government, but a Royal Commission into truth telling. And this is where I think some of those things will come out. So a lot of our sites in Victoria are under a register, a Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Register, but only 6% of the whole state has been surveyed for these sites. So I guess we go with gut feeling on many of these places where we might go around and think, oh, there's a bad feeling here, and maybe we'll do a smoking ceremony, or maybe I shouldn't be in that place because it's a men's place and I'm a woman, or whatever it be.
And just about in terms of, say, the Western idea of time, so we look at the Eureka Stockade, for example, where 35 people died at this site 168 years ago. But of course, this has happened on Wadawurrung land, where there was significant dispossession, possibly even deaths at this very site. We don't know because the records aren't clear. Yeah. But we know that we now know that there were many massacres across Australia, and there's a lot more dialogue around that. And you talked about truth-telling before. Yeah. So in terms of time, we make a big deal about Eureka Stockade, and we think for very good reason, because of its contribution to the democracy we enjoy in this country. But with that, we're focused on that 168 years, and that's the big moment, and we've focused on that, but what does that do to the Indigenous story?
Look, I think once we start telling the truth, it's our shared history of what actually happened. So it's not about blaming people of what happened. It happened. And still today, there's still things that are happening. We look at things like the Royal Commission into deaths in custody. They're still happening for Indigenous peoples. So it's ongoing. What I can say is that a lot of people look for something tangible. And, if we've got this beautiful building and in 50 years' time, they'll say, well, don't pull down the Eureka Centre. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a historical landmark. But what was here that was prior to that, and we might not ever know. And we have done some archaeology in the area and we haven't been able to find those sites because it's already been dug up. So a lot of our history is intangible. It's about the storytelling. It's around about what is subsurface. We do a lot of archaeology, a lot of anthropology, but it's not seen. And a lot of it's spiritual as well. So it's feelings. What was the last part of your question? What does it do for Indigenous people around?
Well, I guess the thing is, we might think, for example, bringing it back to dark tourism, we might think 100 years is enough to talk about 100 people that died, and maybe to even find some irreverence in that storytelling. But I don't think we can do that with Indigenous people. And the notions of time, I don't mean to speak for Indigenous people, but there are different notions of time. So that experience goes back more than 100 years or more than 1,000 years, and that cultural continuity links back to a much earlier period than I guess we think about from a Western perspective when we look at our historic settler sites here.
Yeah. So we want to talk about those sites, and we want to put monuments at those sites. We want people to go and visit those sites. We want people to feel just what they would feel like at the Eureka, coming into this space and going, wow, what happened on this site? So, I can't say that it won't happen. I think we would like people to then, once this truth telling commission comes through, maybe there's more in the treaty process of going, let's actually take people out on sites and let them feel what might have actually happened here. So, I don't know, I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous peoples, but I certainly would love the stories to be told, and maybe even the stories now of that intergenerational trauma that we may not even know that we have. So there's something genetically, we all have a story. There's something, when you have trauma, it gets carried through genetically. So what is it? There's things that are still playing out without us even knowing, and that's that kind of, some of it can be tangible, but it's just about what was the story, what is the story, and what's going to be the future story. I hope that answers your question, but I don't have all the answers, but I have dreams.
I guess it's about those multi-layered histories on the land, the Indigenous and I guess the Western or settler, or however we want to define it, and ensuring that both those stories can be told, and recognising that time is different, perceived differently in the Western sense and in the Indigenous sense. And certainly a Western story then doesn't supplant the Indigenous story.
That's right. And look, even we do love that anthropologists were coming through this area, because they did document a lot of those things that were happening, or maybe even making them look a little bit fancier than what they were as well. But what we do need to see is more Indigenous academics having a perspective on writing these stories as well. So we might be able to see, which look, Ian Clark and Fred Carr are doing an amazing job of trying to bring our stories forward, but then we need Indigenous people to come through and say, actually now it's our turn for a perspective on this history. So look, not all of us are academics, and it might be difficult, but maybe we just need to say, right, this is a story of Wadawurrung people in the goldfields. Well, actually, it's not what I heard. Yes, that's great that we've got that perspective, because that's what was recorded. But maybe we need to chime in and go, well, now we need to write our perspective. That might take a long time, but I think more Indigenous perspectives need to be heard.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you.
And Tara, we were talking before about how in historical storytelling, often we tell the story of the elites, the wealthy, because they're the bottom of the pile. People with mental illnesses, people involved in what might have been considered criminal in the day, where we've got their mug shots and the details of their trials. And I guess the question is, over time, particularly those marginalised histories, they come out and we get to see these people, and sometimes they're not always represented in a flattering light. Do you have any thoughts around that idea that time makes it more possible to more irreverently approach people's stories, or do you think that creates a problem, especially in relation to dark tourism?
Well, I'm coming from a position where I'm dealing with lunatic asylums, and in that context, absolutely we can go back 100 years and talk about this particular individual, but I think we always need to think about the fact that while this is one patient, we've actually had a continuing line of patients. And so if we're irreverent about somebody who perhaps died in an asylum 120 years ago, we do really need to think about the context of, we may be having an audience member who has actually also spent time in possibly one of the actual lunatic asylums, because they were still around in the 80s. It's quite a recent phenomenon, the care in the community. And I mean, there's still, hospitalisation today. So I think that there's definitely more room that you can really go into it without worrying about those particular people. But I think there's always that need to understand that while one story may be finite, there's actually always a continuation of that story. So I think that it's not that we can't tell the stories. I think there's just a level of respect that is necessary, and doesn't mean we can't joke about these sorts of things, but just that we recognise that there is a person behind that. And like you were saying, that we tend to just see this one tiny part of someone's life. So someone may well have been in an asylum for a month. And if that's the only record we have of that person, are we really making the entirety of, they may have lived 90 years and we're focusing on this one period of illness. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with my research, is look at the people on either side of that period. And I think it's a time thing as well, that it's hard because we have that distance. It's difficult for us to find the whole person. So, but definitely, I mean, I chose my period on purpose, really, because I can get at that, and you can get the records. And that's the other thing too, that we have privacy laws, but it's a difficult area always.
And also in telling the stories of women with that passing of time, there are horrific stories that can be told, and there can be a kind of a lurid fascination with stories that relate to women's mental health, women's sexuality. Do you have any concerns around the way those stories may be, with the passing of time? Because we wouldn't be speaking about people's lived experience now, perhaps in the way that we might speak about those in the past. And every now and then you'll see something about women criminals from the turn of the century, and the stories are told in an irreverent way. It's like, oh, this is a person that did this, and how interesting, here's their mugshot. Whereas we'd be a lot more sensitive if somebody that was maybe either recently departed or living.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that we bring a contemporary perspective to everything always, and that can be an issue. So, for instance, with sex workers, people may have actually been dubbed a sex worker, but it wouldn't be somebody who was doing sex work that we would consider that in this day and age. It may just have been a woman who was living with a man out of wedlock, and that's dubbed on her record. So if we're suddenly saying this person was this with our contemporary idea of it, that distorts the picture. And I think that there's often that issue, and I think in the academic world, we all take our own perspectives and our own ideas, and I think I personally disagree with a lot of the feminist history of psychiatry and asylums, because it's going in there with a particular axe to grind a lot of the time. So they're looking for the cases where a woman was put in an asylum because her husband wanted to get rid of her. And it's not that that didn't happen, but it's such a small percentage of the cases. And so I think if we're going there and we want to tell a story, we pick these things out with our modern ideas of what we want to see. And I think that can actually be quite damaging to the ability to actually find the real stories, because we're going in there and we think, well, we want to see this, so we will see it with those blinkered perspectives.
Yeah. Thanks, Tara. And Nathaniel, so if you're, I guess, crafting a ghost tour or a dark tourism experience, and you can define this any way you like, because I know you've done a lot of things at a lot of different sites, how do you respond to that issue of time? How much time needs to pass until it's okay for you to go in there and your public is going to feel comfortable enough to buy into that experience?
It's a fascinating question, and something that influences my work deeply. And to give you a little bit of background, how I arrived in this position, I started off as a history teacher. I went to Europe and was working for Kentucky Tours. While I was working for Kentucky Tours, every Kentucky tour must go to one concentration camp And so I'm taking people to Auschwitz, Dachau, Mauthausen. I'm also fascinated by war history, so I'm taking people to Gallipoli, I'm taking people to the Somme. And I've got a sociopathic mind, I guess. At the end of the day, I thought, what's more interesting, taking people to beautiful Paris at night time, or watching the reaction from the raw emotion when you take people into a gas chamber. And I became fascinated with that. And so when I finished working for Kentucky, I was like, well, I want to go and explore dark tourism more, and worked around in Europe, London, Edinburgh, Paris, working for ghost tours. Cutting long story short, lived on site at Port Arthur for eight months almost, came here, saw Lydiard Street, and the first thing I saw when I saw Lydiard Street is just soaking with blood. And thought, wow, that's a good spot for a ghost tour. And it was. And then 3 years after that, we got the keys for Arrowdale, and now Arrowdale is one of 3 of the largest ghost tours in the Southern Hemisphere. Well, last night we had 220 people through Arrowdale last night. So I look at that and I say, well, okay, I'm obviously a bit sick because I'm fascinated by people's reaction, but it's not just me, because people are coming. So dark tourism is reflective of people's fascination with death. And the dark tourist provider it's whether people are comfortable with it or not, but dark tourism is absolutely about making as much money as possible. All tourism is. But then we have to balance that. How do we make money off a site? And that money can go to a whole different range of situations. It can go to benefiting the survivors. It can go to maintaining the site, which is usually old and expensive. It can go to maintaining the business structure. But we have to balance that with how do we make as much money off a site of tragedy as possible? And so we have to present the worst details. People want the gory details. And at Arrowdale, I'm very lucky. I have a fully intact mortuary, and that is hands down the most popular part of my tour. So people want gory details, and it is up to us to provide those. Otherwise, we watch very carefully our reviews. We know whether we're doing a good job or not in giving the people what we want, because there's a thing called Google reviews, and we sit there every morning going, what do they say? And we know people want controversy. And it's a very fine line. How do we deal with this over time? And as I said, I worked at Auschwitz, and I've seen dark tourism there, and Auschwitz is hands down the largest dark tourism project in the world. There's like 2 million people a year going through Auschwitz. But you look at what Auschwitz is doing and compare that to, say, Port Arthur, and Auschwitz is presented as a factual tour. Port Arthur, Arrowdale, we have ghost tours. I don't think we're ever going to see a ghost tour in Port Arthur or the killing fields in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. I don't think we're ever going to.
ghost tours in Port Arthur.
Yeah, I'm sorry, not ghost tour in Port Arthur, ghost tour at Auschwitz, and ghost tour in the killing fields of Phnom Penh. I don't think we'll ever see that. So what is the difference between Auschwitz and Port Arthur or Arrowdale? And when I'm writing a tour, again, we have to be really careful with sensitivities of people in the audience. And I don't know who's going to be in my audience. And as you said, you found out that you have a relative at Arrowdale. And I have to be aware of that when I'm writing. So for us, time is so important. Everything that I write when I'm writing a tour is set in the 1800s. As far back as possible as I can, because the further back in history it goes, the less likely I am to offend someone now. Names, just don't use them, because you might be talking about someone's grandfather. Interestingly, when I started at Arrowdale, I copped a lot of criticism, and it wasn't from relatives of the patients, it was from relatives of the staff who didn't want the actions of their family being discussed openly. So that's something we have to take into account as well. So names, you don't need names in a ghost tour, really. Why do we tell ghost stories as opposed to Auschwitz? Auschwitz, the ghost tour would be totally inappropriate, but I am telling ghost stories, and right. And again, it comes back to capitalism. If I called Arrowdale Ghost Tours and I changed the name to Arrowdale Night Tours, I reckon I'd get a tenth of the customers. So what's a ghost? How do we justify that? And so for us, a ghost becomes a scar on the collective conscience. And it's a way of memorialising that tragedy in a way that is accessible for a wide range or a wide audience. So I can talk about a woman in Arrowdale who was a nurse, what she used to wear and what they used to do. That's fine. And some people will engage with it. Or I can say to people, or sometimes we see a figure walking down the corridor in a white dress and a white hat and looking all nursey like that, and people get an emotional response as well. So not only are they thinking, okay, that's what the nurse looks like, they're also freaking out because they might see it, which is cool. So that sensitivity around the recent events, I think probably one of the best examples I saw in Australia was a couple of years ago. A dark tourism provider put together a tour, and it wasn't even a ghost tour, it was just visiting the sites of the Ivan Milat murders. And that was shut down straight away because it was deemed to be too soon. And we have a saying in the dark tourism world, it's quite simple, too soon. If I start talking about people's incidences at Arrowdale in the 1980s, I know I'm going to get shot down. So if I talk about 20th century history at Arrowdale, I'm talking more about the evolution of the process of psychiatry and the missing people's stories, because you don't know there. So I believe that there's absolutely a place for dark tourism immediately after an incident. I say that because at Port Arthur, when the prison shut down, immediately people were curious. They wanted to go and see Port Arthur. But it was up until the 1970s, which was almost 100 years after Port Arthur shut down, that they said, yeah, we can have a ghost tour. It's been 25 years since Arrowdale shut down before I can get the keys to run a ghost tour. And I'm pretty sure if I asked for the keys the day it shut down, they'd say, no, wait, that's way too fresh, too soon. So I think time is incredibly important. The more removed we are from the tragedy, the less we're going to take offence at the connection.
Yeah, great. Okay, so now I want to share something from David. It's a quote from anthropologist Kelly George, writing on dark tourism in relation to the Penhurst Asylum in the United States. And she said, the way the phenomenon of dark tourism is described made me feel ick. A haunted house at a former institution, that's just wrong. The more I thought about it, the more apathetic I became. In part because I considered the cultural environment in which this phenomenon took place, I began to see its existence as a foregone conclusion. In other words, to fit with everything I knew about disability representation and the scarcity of disability consciousness in the general population. And yet I couldn't see a way to deal with the attraction without falling into the same old routine. Popular culture is a wasteland of ignorance and hegemony, especially when it comes to the way the public abuses history. So that's a pretty powerful kind of reaction to the way in which, I think it might be relating specifically to mental health disability, is filtered through the lens of popular culture, through dark tourism. So is she right? Is popular culture a wasteland of ignorance when it comes to engaging with these sites? And how do we balance the impact of popular culture on audience expectations with the lived experience of real people connected to these locations, whether they were there, whether they're descendants, or whether they're people, advocates from communities that have a direct investment in those stories?
I'll chuck my 2 cents in.
No, you're first. So
yeah. Just briefly, it's like I understand where you're coming from. I've been criticised for being exploitative, and I can see where people are coming from. But the alternative is, would you rather I not do it? The money is going into the building. The stories are being told. Those memories are being remembered, and we're doing it in a way that may not. Well, I think we've got great reviews. People love Arrowdale. We're very lucky we've got an amazing building, but we're very careful to craft the tour in a way that is balanced. But if you took away dark tourism, you're going to take away the means for a lot of those stories to be remembered and a way for a lot of those facilities to be maintained. And so it comes to a price like, okay, do you want the stories told? Do you want the building maintained or not? We have to do what we can with the building. Say, for example, Arrowdale. What am I going to do with Arrowdale? Like, no one, it sat there for 25 years. No one did anything with it until I came along and said, hey, ghost tours. And it's instantly a hit. So that's just the reality of tourism. And it's not just dark tourism, it's all tourism.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, she's specifically talking about sensitivities around disability. But here at the Eureka Centre, for example, when we look at our audiences, we know audiences coming in for a deep dive. So we use this idea of skim, dip, dive. So sometimes you do need to say, hey, they don't care for the whole story. They actually don't even have empathy for the individual stories. They want the ghost tour. Or in our case, they want to see the flag. And that's it. So skim, dip, dive is what we use to acknowledge the fact that people want different things. And in the case of dark tourism, for institutions, that's a viable strategy to engage audiences on their terms. So you've got a tension there, haven't you? You've got the stakeholders that are going like, we don't like the way the story is told. But then you've got the audience saying, oh, but I want the ghost tour.
Exactly. And perhaps one of the greatest sources of our 1-star reviews on Google when we get them is because people didn't see a ghost. That's all right. If that's what we're getting criticised for, fine.
And Tara, what are your thoughts on that kind of balance between, I guess, respectful storytelling, representing the interests and concerns of groups, and I guess just the practical needs to engage an audience?
Well, I think that there's an assumption with that quote that that pop culture and fictional accounts and, the popular media is always evil. And I think that's a really elitist point of view. I think that there's certainly a lot of academics who they research the same things that, other people might be going to tours, and they feel that they have a bit of moral superiority because they're coming at it from the ivory tower. But we all have the same reasons to get into it. And for instance, I got into it through Victorian sensation fiction. I was coming in from that same aspect. And I think that there's space for pop culture to have, these multiple voices. And for the majority of people, that's how they're getting their history. If we start saying, oh, well, you can't have tours, you can't have tourism, you can't have your BBC period dramas, then what happens to the history? Without Arrowdale has ghost tours, Kew Asylum is a housing complex for rich people in Kew now. So of those two, which is better, the one that people actually can go and interact with the site, or the one where you can go once a year on open day, and otherwise it's this closed community? And I think that the key is allowing for multiple perspectives and multiple voices and upholding the ones we find good, and just realising that we all do need to interact with things differently. And for some people, they're getting some of it, even if it's little tiny bits in amongst the ghosts and things like that.
Yeah, well, look, and that's exactly our experience here. If an audience member comes in, they often know what they want.
Yeah.
And you want to give them, the facts and an experience that, I guess, gives them the best opportunity to engage with the history that you're telling. But hey, if they just want the ghost tour, they want the ghost tour and take the money, and then you can maybe invest in, I don't know, the restoration of an artefact. So I can absolutely see that. But the point about elitism as well, I think, is a really good one as well.
See, I'm interested in death, and I'm fascinated with the idea of Aboriginal massacre. I know that occurred, but I don't know where. And I would like to know more about that for my own culture's knowledge as well.
There's one registered at Bunnington.
Yeah, but to have a guide there to explain it to me, so that's what happened there. That's good for European Australians to know. Yeah, we've got to take ownership of that as well. And if you guys are presenting that to us, then it's educating us about our responsibilities as well.
That's a perfect segue, because I was going to ask exactly that sort of question. Who would own, obviously Indigenous people would own that, introducing people to those sites?
I think it would, we would hold the intellectual property around that, and it would be appropriate for Wadawurrung people to guide those type of sites, and not just going to pigeonhole that though. So I have been working with the History Teachers Association of Victoria around bringing our people home, so that our ancestral remains. And these are things that we don't hear about in schools. You might hear about Egypt and ancient Greek and the burial practices of their people, and this is not sort of dark history, but it's saying that in our landscape we still have thousands upon thousands of our ancestral remains out in there in the landscape. And we're doing archaeology. It's a huge business here in Victoria, And as of, just even today, we know that there's some housing estate happening on our traditional country where we've just found a burial, and there's plenty more of those. So there are hundreds of ancestral remains that sit in the Museum Victoria, just in boxes, just sitting in this one room that none of you probably know about. Oh, I just got goosebumps again. So a lot of us as traditional owners in Victoria work with the state coroner to see if they're already provenanced, or if they aren't provenanced, then maybe we're working on some projects around some DNA extraction in a non-invasive way to be able to tell a story about where our people are buried and those burial practices. When it comes to our massacre sites, the time is now. The time is now to have that conversation. And as I said earlier, it's not about blame. It's about, let's talk about what was happening. There were past policies that were put in place. I mean, we had the White Australia policy. We weren't able to be an Aboriginal person in this country, and until 1967, Aboriginal people weren't even in the census, so they were under the Flora and Fauna Act as animals in their own lands for many, many years. So the time is now to tell those stories, and some of those massacre sites that, in the Scars of the Landscape, you'll see some of those recorded, but there were so many more. I think, look, there probably will be a tourism aspect that Aboriginal people will look at, but more in a, let's talk about the truth. I'm more worried about non-Indigenous people being offended than myself, and I'm not talking on behalf of everyone, this is me. I'm more worried about people getting, I have friends that you say, I can't believe that my family did that, and I was like, I don't want you to be fatigued, or I don't want you to be paralysed by feeling like that, because it wasn't something you did and you're identifying what happened in the past. Let's talk about the truth. Let's talk about what happened in these sites, and let's actually put it out there for our children to learn the real history of Australia. And I went to Talbot Primary School, and I was still singing with my hand on my heart, God Save the Queen, every Monday morning, and never learned anything about Aboriginal people. That was just a thing. But these days, I'm really, really excited that our young people are learning more and more about Aboriginal history. What I can put out there is, if you've got any family journals, this is to anyone, if you've got any family journals, even if they say something that's horrible about Aboriginal people, we would love to see it, because what it does for us is, although you might feel really, really awful about it, for us we go, we were there, our family were actually on their station, working on the land. There might be check butts, there might be these. These are all the stories that we don't have anymore. So even if it feels awful, I'm saying bring them forward. We'd love to hear about them.
I'd actually like to say something about that, just because we have such a shame culture. And I think that there's an enormous amount of white shame for our connection with what has gone. And that means we ignore that history. We just push it under, and it's the same with the area I work in, that there is so much shame attached to mental health. And so people think, well, I don't want people knowing my great-grandmother was there. And it just, that means that these truths don't get told, because, the people who might have the ability to tell them, it's something inside them that they don't want to let it out. So, yeah, I think that that's really important in all of these aspects, and certainly, for you, it's just vital.
I think it's generational too. So I'll even have elders that will say, "Oh, my parents were married," and I sort of sit back going, "They weren't." So I'll still have elders that won't want to hear those truths as well. So that might hurt them, and so there is that time factor again in saying, well, maybe I'm a little bit desensitized to these things because generationally that's what was told. And I don't know if people out here use Trove, but I love Trove. It's a website, just saying, with all the digitised newspapers, and the amount of things I hear about Aboriginal people and the way they were spoken about, I'm okay with, because it is our history, and so I do gain a lot of insight as to what was the narrative at the time, and even with your records with the asylums, you're going to see how they spoke.
Different terminology.
It's the terminology.
And it feels quite threatening to a modern person, but it was just the terminology at the time. Yeah.
Lunatic.
Yeah, well, exactly.
So just on that, Bonnie, and I'm not imagining these will be sites of dark tourism per se, though horrible dark things have happened there. But let's say we look at a site where massacres occurred, say in Buninyong, which you mentioned. Now we've got this process of truth-telling going on, treaty in Victoria. The government's giving every indication that they'll support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We've got so many new representatives in Parliament, the federal Parliament, Indigenous representatives. So there's been a massive shift in the culture. How is that going to then translate into maybe the way we look at these sites, acknowledge, protect, and interpret the sites and bring people into those sites from your perspective?
Look, I might not even be around. It could be the next generation or generation after, and we still don't have a treaty, obviously, with our government. That is something that we're working on. But the Europe Truth-Telling Commission coming out of that is a big win for us. So they have to have their first draft in by June this year, and the final draft, the final by 2024. So I can see there will be a lot of information of those elders that are still in our communities that do still have some of that oral history. A lot of that has been lost. I'm just excited by the younger generations. I honestly, I think they're the ones that are going to look at us and go, oh, you crusty old people, like, what were you thinking at the time? Even today, me talking, I try and say, oh, I don't want to offend people. I don't want people to feel like this. And they're coming through and they're just like, I'm just going to say whatever I want. We've got 2-year-olds doing acknowledgement of country and know what they're doing. They're just like, this is the land, these type of things. And these are non-Indigenous students, like babies. And I'm going, well, we're all right. We're doing all right.
Good. Now I want to talk a little about stakeholders. So, who owns these sites where traumatic things have occurred? Who are the stakeholders? How do we manage stakeholder expectations? Not only around dark tourism, but you might have, I don't know, for example, J Ward has weddings. It's a beautiful building. Now have weddings there. Or Pentridge is now accommodation.
Lakeside?
When I used to drive past Pentridge when I was a kid, I was terrified of Pentridge. And there are people who were in Pentridge that now drive past, and people are living in very nice apartments. So, these things can happen quite quickly, and there can be a real kind of tension between various stakeholder groups. So, I guess, how do we work with these stakeholders, or how do the stakeholders work with the various competing stakeholders, but also what contribution does dark tourism make to funding the maintenance of these sites to allow the stakeholders to interpret, or in case of businesses that are running dark tourism enterprises to run their business, and maybe descendants or people that have lived experience at those sites to come and have the experience that they're seeking. So we've kind of touched on this, but just interested to maybe look specifically at that stakeholder experience, given that there are often multiple stakeholders at these sites. So perhaps starting with you, Tara.
I think at the moment we're not doing it very well. I think that it's often sort of put in the too hard basket, because once you start thinking about, who actually does have a right to have a say, then it just gets bigger and bigger and explodes. But I guess coming from my perspective as a historian, I want these sites preserved. I don't want them torn down or to just sort of slide away into the environment. And often it's down to where the money is, and that could be tourism, because we don't. In the UK, they have the National Lottery, and that helps fund a lot of their historical sites, and here it's all these grants and everything, and they cost a fortune to maintain these older places. So if we can involve the commercial aspect, that can actually mean that things are preserved that otherwise wouldn't be preserved. So I think that it ends up being that we have to look at where the money is a lot of the time, unfortunately. But if we can do that in a way that as much as possible incorporates the opinions of the other people who these sites are important to. And that's difficult, because you can't say, well, this person's an ex-patient and they want this to happen, because one person can't speak for the group ever. And we do have to look at the attendants, the doctors, because they cared a lot about these places as well. And so, yeah, it's difficult.
It is. And Nathaniel, have you ever come head to head with somebody that has not liked what you're doing because they feel that you're misinterpreting the story or the building or...
Yeah, funnily enough, I have actually. But I don't want to talk about one. I want to talk about another example that didn't happen to me because it was probably one of the first examples I noticed of the conflict. And it was at Port Arthur. And it was a great example because we talked down at Port Arthur on the ghost tour and on the day tour, but more on the ghost tour about a reverend that was there in 1860s. And the ghost tour narrative paints him as a hellfire and brimstone Protestant bastard. Reverend Hayward. And he, 1870s, 1860s, he was at Port Arthur, and the family's still down on the peninsula. And so we want to talk about that, and he's relevant. He's an important figure. He was the religious instructor for the convicts, but we're not going to paint him in a particularly nice fashion. And the sources don't particularly paint him in a particularly nice fashion either. So, but the family was not happy about the fact that we were talking about him at all, and particularly the light that we were putting him in. And at the end of the day, we just went, you know what? If you want to tell the story, you're welcome to go and do it. We're telling the story, and you can't please everyone. You can try and please everyone. You can keep your history in the distance. You can omit names and things like that. But people will be offended at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, you know, you just like any business, you've just got to go, it's water off the duck's back. Is most of the people happy? Are we getting 4.5 stars out of 5 on Facebook? The majority of the people are appreciating what we're doing. And it's funny because we see lots of customers come for lots of different reasons. And it's not just ghosts, and it's not just death, it's architecture, it's history, it is family connections. We have people come into Arrowdale and they do a ghost tour of Arrowdale, and they did have a family member that died in there, and that's one of the only ways that they can see inside the building. So, good. I had a woman come to Arrowdale one night and did a ghost tour, and her mother had died in Arrowdale, and I watched her sprinkle rose petals on the floor in one of the cells. We didn't know which cell it was in, but okay, that's symbolic, that'll do. And we left the rose petals there for a while and said to the customers, that's there because a woman visited. Now, yeah, I'm going to cop criticism, but look at, we left that woman into the building. So what do you want me to do? Let the building fall over and no one remembers, or make it as useful as possible?
But you handled it compassionately as well.
You have to have compassion. Yeah, you have to.
So perhaps maybe another dark tourism operator may not have. What do you feel? Let's speak to speak to your industry.
Absolutely.
From your
Let's
experience.
speak to the industry. We're businessmen, and like any business, you can run a good business and you can run a bad business. And if you're running a bad ghost tour that's not disrespectful, people will start to talk about it. You'll be out of business pretty quickly. That's the same with any business. So you know we have to present that balanced view, because we walk such a fine line, and it is such a sensitive issue that if we do cross that line and someone really takes offence, they can do a lot of damage. So, you know, that awareness needs to be maintained all the time. We do at Arrowdale, interestingly, and it took me about 3 years before I got my head around the idea. We do paranormal investigations at Arrowdale, where instead of being the focus of it being on the story of the building, it's actually the focus is trying to find evidence of paranormal activity in the building. And they get heaps of different equipment to do that. They've got motion sensors and night vision goggles and everything. And the customer isn't really interested in the history. They've been watching Ghost Adventures on TV and they want to catch a ghost. Can I justify this to myself? It took me a bit of a while to justify it, but I'm like, even if the person has left the building, they've contributed financially to the maintenance of the building by coming in the first place, and I've given them a little bit of history, then it's justified. So for me, it's people leaving the building, knowing more about the building than they did when they arrived is the trade-off.
So we'll talk now about Indigenous custodianship and traditional ownership of the land. So every site that we have that might tell a settler story, there's always going to be Indigenous custodianship, and the emphasis may not be on that, but I think increasingly institutions are looking to work with Indigenous people to, at least in some meaningful way, tell the story of that ownership and that cultural continuity. I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts on how to best work with Indigenous people to tell their story within the context of a tourism attraction, museum, institution, site.
I guess, well, for Wadawurrung, we don't have many of us left. So out of the 25 clan groups that we did have, we have one left. And we all come from the same apical ancestor, so one apical ancestor. And look, we all have a bit of that history as well. Like, we come from a man called John Robertson, who was a Scotsman, and he had children with Queen Mary. And then Queen Mary had John Robertson, who changed his name to John Robinson. So he, at the time, would have been classed as a half-caste. And then he had children with a woman who was Irish, Margaret Ann Matthews, and she was a governess. They must have worked on the same station. So her family shunned her, and so we've still got that even in our family where, you know, Margaret Ann Matthews' family didn't want to know that he was with an Aboriginal woman, and then had these 7 children who we all descend from. So we've got it in our family. What I can say is that everything would need to be done on a localised level. That, you know, if you're working with Wadawurrung, we're probably really stretched and really fatigued because it's not our core business. Our core business, we sit under the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act as what is called a registered Aboriginal party. And what that means is that we need to do a lot of archaeology every day in our business and look after when infrastructure's coming. So if you've got a railway line that's going to go through, you know, we need to go and do that, a cultural heritage management plan, just like you would do a flora and fauna assessment. We have these ones for Aboriginal cultural heritage. So a lot of our time is in that. And it's not always about money. So people will say, I've got the funding, can you do this with us? Because we actually just don't have the people to do it. And we're scattered everywhere, and we have a lot of people that are not Wadawurrung working with us. I don't work in the family corporation. I do a lot of work with them. I used to run the corporation many years ago. But there's places around Ballarat that have this localised history where we could be doing some more. And as an example, if you went to the Ballarat New Cemetery, you'll find the grave of Mullawalla. And, you know, it's this formation, this rock formation, and it's got a sign there saying King Billy of Ballarat. And I do believe that the Old Colonists Club paid for his funeral. So we've got that joint history. It doesn't really cross over very well because people go, oh, the Old Colonists. Like, why would the Aboriginal people be with the Old Colonists? You know, but at the time, he was friendly with them, King Billy, and they've got photographs of his funeral, and then they built this monument. Now, his grave is kind of collapsing at the moment, and that's where I've talked to the Old Colonists Club and saying, well, do you want to work together again? So that's why I guess we could do, people can go to King Billy's grave and learn the story about Mullawalla. He's just one person in Ballarat, but there's so many other places. And as I go around doing just talks in localised areas, and I've been doing this a lot on Wadawurrung country, people just say, I know of this, and I know of that, and I do want to have a look at it. And I'm like, yes, we want to know all of these things. So I'm doing a talk at, where is it? Smythesdale, I think it is, next week, I think. Anyway, and then the gentleman rang me up and said, I hear you're doing a talk on cultural heritage in the area. I said, yeah. He said, do you know of old Joe's grave? No, I don't. He's like, oh, I'll take you. Here's an Aboriginal man that was in this area, and oh, Joe, I'll take you to his grave. There's a monument there. I'm like, wow, like, I don't know everything on Wadawurrung country, but it will be localised, and it will be how people are feeling in their localised area.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'll ask one more question, and then I'll open up for some questions. So the final thing I want to talk about is representation. Who tells the stories, how they tell the stories, who are the gatekeepers. So often the gatekeeper might be a museum director, or it could be somebody from Parks and Gardens, and you know, often they can be quite clear about what their mandate is and very perhaps narrow in their remit. including in the way they might interpret. And then someone like Nathaniel comes in and says, I want to do a ghost tour here. And some of them might throw their hands in the air and go, oh, I don't know. So let's talk about the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And we were talking before about elitism as well.
Yeah.
Because I think that talking about gatekeepers, elitism, access. Who's getting access on whose terms? Let's talk about that, maybe beginning with you, Tara.
Well, I think this is a bit about the elitism. I mean, in history, it's only fairly recently that we've started actually considering oral history a worthwhile form of history. And I mean, that's a very limited perspective, and it ignores so many relevant tales. And we were talking before about the levels of people, and it ignores our family stories and important tales that have been passed down. In terms of stakeholders, I think that there is the looking at the elite histories of things. We're looking at the CEO of an area is deciding these things rather than actually, getting input from other people. But I think we are getting better at it. I think it's a slow process. I think we're starting to think about who else might have some input on an area and who else might be able to provide input on an area from a different perspective. So.
Just on that, I also think that people that are perceived as gatekeepers, and perhaps I might be perceived as a gatekeeper by some people, I think within, say, the museum sector, people are very, very conscious about breaking down those barriers, being approachable, creating multiple entry points. But that doesn't mean that the institution doesn't loom so large, and people's preconceptions about museums, historic sites, culture, history, that alone is so entrenched in people's thinking that it will alienate them regardless of how open, how accommodating, even if you allow for co-custodianship of collections, there's still going to be those kind of barriers, because historically people have felt completely alienated and they've been talked at rather than being engaged in the conversation. So do you have any thoughts on that, Tara?
Well, I think I have more thoughts on that from the literary sector, actually, rather than museums. In terms of, we have this great movement at the moment towards own voices, storytelling, and all of the big publishing houses are really pushing for this at the moment. But while they're wanting this content, the people who are the gatekeepers in the publishing industry are not generally these own voices people. So while they want to hear these stories, the ones that they're looking for are the ones that resonate with them. And so for a lot of people who, might have those stories, it still does seem such an insurmountable thing, because it doesn't matter that they're calling out for that if they feel like they won't be interested in my story, or else once you put something out in the publishing world, you lose control of it. So you don't know, will this be marketed ethically? What cover are they going to put on the front of this book? Is it going to look like a Mills and Boon, whereas it's my tragic memoir or something like that? So I think that even as we move towards a more inclusive way of looking at these things, there is still the top level is still a certain group of people generally, that even if they're encouraging those voices, it can feel a little scary at times to try and break into, I think, or just,
Yes, of course, Bonnie.
I'll just add to that too. As an Aboriginal woman, and for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I think we feel over-researched as well. So we're very cautious in being able to voice, or tell our story, because what is the outcome? So it's easy enough for me to say, well, I'd like to tell a story about this, and then all of a sudden it goes off to a publisher, and then they cut, and they make it about the way they want to perceive it, and like you said, what they want to hear. So a lot of people that you might want to interview, or you want to say, hey, I really want to get to know this about you or your family, or do this piece, we're very cautious. We're very cautious. And that could come with that intergenerational trauma of going, well, you were taking our information and then all of a sudden we lost it all together, kind of thing. So people are very cautious, and we probably brought up to say, don't tell them anything. Don't tell them anything. Don't tell them all the time. So I don't know. I think we're just a bit more cautious, or we don't think that we're probably smart enough. a lot of the times. Honestly, that's me, because I worked at the university here for many years, but still, I could have a degree. It doesn't mean I feel like people want to hear my story, or I'm going to write it in an academic manner that's going to be high enough sort of status that people are going to want to read it at the academic level. I think I'm working on that because I teach the way I want to teach. And I think people are actually engaging the way I teach on a daily basis. And I don't use these big fancy words, and I think it works for me and maybe my audience, I'm not sure. But I think it's just a bit like, oh, this is a little bit too daunting. Unless I have a doctorate in something, then how am I going to be taken seriously? That's what I think maybe. And there have been people in the past, like your Aboriginal protectorates. I'm really fascinated with Andrew Porteous at the moment. And, that was his way of saying something. And I've seen something on Trove, actually. So Withers wrote The History of Ballarat. And then I've watched in Trove Andrew Porteous actually ripping him to shreds, saying that was all untrue. That's what I want to hear. I want to hear that. Andrew Porteous, the Aboriginal protectorate, Withers going, that's not true about the Aboriginal people. That's not true about the Aboriginal people. So I love that sort of stuff too.
Can I touch on that, please?
Do love a bit of conflict there.
I think you need to have connection with the topic. If you have no connection with the topic, then your dark tourism project is on shaky legs. My job is to come up with the goriest details for shock value, but then how do I tell that? And I think that if you can tell it with a certain sympathy, then your audience will react more. And that's appropriate at Arundel. I generally take the side of the patients, and if I'm taking the piss out of anything, it's the system. You would never see a German doing a tour of Auschwitz. The majority of the tour guides that aren't working for Kentucky, that are employed by Auschwitz, are Jewish. When you go to Phnom Penh, you don't see members of the Khmer Rouge doing tours of the killing fields. This is presented from a sympathetic side. So if you have that sympathy in your presentation, it does give you a little bit of freedom to go as gory as you want, because that's what people want in the first place. They want to be shot. They're going to a place of death because they want to learn about death.
But they don't want to feel bad while
you
doing
don't
it.
want to make them feel guilty.
So they want to feel that empathy themselves, so that they're not just going, ooh, blood.
And so I would never present a tour at an Aboriginal massacre site because I don't have that connection to be able to present the level of sympathy.
Yeah, yep. And even on those massacre sites, these were happening not from just European people, they were tribe to tribe as well. So talking about even what was happening between the tribes would be really awesome to talk about boundaries and what was happening there, and people stealing women from this tribe and then getting killed over there, and those type of things would be amazing. I think it's time to bring out those stories though. I really would enjoy that. Our sites are on a heritage register. So where you might have heritage in Victoria, they have all of your buildings and things on a heritage register. The Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Register is closed, and for good reason. Unfortunately, minority of people, once they hear about an Aboriginal site, they'll go and destroy it. So just as a way of an example, Lake Byron Beach on the southern side, 2016, the only 2 trees that were cut down there were 2 of our canoe trees, and they didn't cut them up for firewood or anything of the sort, so they just fell them and they just left them there. So we've had bunting around those since 2016. Unfortunately, earlier this year, somebody started cutting them up, even though they were fenced off, and we've had to take them from that site out to some land that we have. But there are minority people that because there's not enough education around, people think that Aboriginal people are going to come and take their land, or they're going to come and camp on their land, or those things. And there needs to be more education. That's what I educate on, I guess, is to say we can't and we don't want to. So, there will be those minority people that will, but usually for Wadawurrung, we're not trying to do that. There'll be a minority group that might do that, but that's not everybody.
No.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good example of how you've got, really extremed in the way that somebody might respond to, a particular situation. cultures involved or as societies of significance.
Yeah.
You've got absolutely nowhere to kind of meet in the middle. You've got this extreme kind of
Yep.
behaviour based on ignorance and probably hatred. And then you've got a cultural group that's trying to protect something and has to actually not share it in order to do that. So it's a good example of the way in which, you know, we interpret and engage audiences in that. It's a terrible, I've heard many examples of that. So, yes, on that note, we've talked about the institution, we've talked about the way that audiences can connect with sites, with history, the way they can feel deeply engaged and the way they can feel somewhat alienated. So we'll open it up to questions. And does anybody have a question for the panel? And if you could, you can direct it to either of the speakers, Bonnie, Tara or Nathaniel, or you might have a question that you want to share with the entire panel. Because I will too. Great.
Nathaniel, is there, in the dark tourism, is there any ideas in the rise towards this, the Chinese mining era of, say, to do with the Lydian Street, where they're buried up there, or is there any ideas or stories?
No, I don't. There are stories, but I don't touch on them. With my ghost tour starts at the train station and finishes at the jail. So I'm concentrating on the built heritage there. Yeah. And because it's a largely European built heritage, I'm talking like that. I don't feel comfortable talking about other cultures and other races too much on my tours because I'm European and I can talk about what I know, and no one's going to challenge me and tell me that I've interpreted anything wrong because I'm perfectly qualified to interpret European history however I want. But that's because I'm of European descent. So I like to leave other cultures and figure it out because I might just be leaving myself open for criticism.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can expand on that. I think that's something that the whole panel could perhaps respond to, ideas of cultural appropriation and whose voice is the right voice to tell the story in various contexts. So Bonnie, thoughts?
As I said before, I think for Wadawurrung's perspective, I think we would hold our own intellectual property and that we would be the most appropriate people to do those tours if that was what we wanted to do in the future. Not to say that there would be some components that we would share with others. I mean, look at our school curriculums. We share some of this with school teachers that need to teach this on a daily basis. So we'll share some things, but when it comes to intimate details of those sites, then I think that we would hold that true to ourselves. And as you said, we wouldn't be speaking about other cultures because that's probably not our realm, that's not our business.
I think for me, with history, sometimes you do have to touch on the other cultures, but it would never be my focus. And certainly once you're getting into the fictional realm, absolutely I stick to European cultures because that's what I know and that's what I feel comfortable with that story, because it does come down to whose story is it and which story can I tell. And I certainly don't want to be stepping on anyone's toes. They should be telling their stories. And so it's up to me as someone with European heritage to promote the stories of people who are from these particular groups rather than me trying to tell them myself. And I'd tell it badly because I don't have the background. So yeah, I think that's more the point. Instead of us telling them, make sure that they're getting out there, which I don't think we're very good at the moment.
Yeah. And do we have any more questions? Well, I'd like to ask the panel about popular perceptions and the reputation, Nathaniel, in fact, of dark tourism. Now, you've, I think, argued the case for the really positive aspect of dark tourism, and you've obviously got a very ethical approach to it. But let's talk about your industry. We touched on it before, and whether or not people in dark tourism in some cases are unethical or not, there are perceptions that you just shouldn't go there. So what do you think?
Exploitation is it's always going to be exploitation. And I guess it's that question of how much exploitation is the community going to put up with until they call you out on it. So I mentioned before, Ivan Milat was shut down straight away. It's that fine line and balance of how do we remember these stories because they're important without looking like we're just here to glorify violence or death or just exploit it as well for purely financial purposes. These are the constant challenges there. So good research, accurate history, keeping it as relevant as possible, keeping it as removed from the public conscience as possible. These are important things.
Okay, so true crime is a massive genre in fiction. There's so much exploitative material, podcasts, books, the most grotesque possible cinematic interpretations of real life events. Why is that so readily consumed and endorsed and accepted, yet...
Because you're all sick.
I listened to that. Going to sleep, real crime, sorry.
Yet if you go to a historic site, there's concern. But not only that, perhaps in Australia we might decide that an Ivan Milat tour or a tour of some other dreadful place where killings have occurred is inappropriate. Yet in the United States, obviously a very different culture with a very different approach to death and violence and gun violence, those tours of where serial killers have committed their crimes are very successful and embraced. There's obviously a massive cultural difference there. Yeah. But I'm curious as to where media comes in. Why is a tour, a visit to a historic site, the cause of such concern, yet people will read about recent awful, macabre kind of murders?
One of the great examples we had recently was the movie about the Port Arthur massacre. What's it called? Maybe the same guys that make Snowtown.
Oh, I was going to say Martin, but it was back to front. His name is...
Probably best let's not talk about his name.
But, it's back to front. That's what it's called. The show is called, sorry.
Right.
But his name back to front.
Yeah.
That's where, and they talk about Port Arthur.
Yeah, and there's a big outcry. Should they be making a movie out of Snowtown? Should they be making a movie out of Port Arthur? I haven't seen the Port Arthur one yet because I haven't got down to get my hands on it. I really do because I saw Snowtown and thought, wow, that's absolutely brilliant storytelling. And was it exploitative? Sure, those guys that made money, that was the whole reason they wanted.
But you wouldn't do that with a tour at Port Arthur. You would not have an exploitative, interpretive experience at Port Arthur at the site, would you?
Too soon.
You could not do it. Too soon. Is it too soon to make a film that's going to, probably seriously upset, probably quite seriously disturb the people who lost loved ones at that site? Why?
I guess
what's
that's
the difference?
The nature of capitalism. You can't stop a movie being made, can you?
But what's the difference?
People are still in prison.
But what's the difference?
Some of them are still alive that we're talking about too. It's too real. It's too... I mean, I work with these prisoners too around the whole of Victoria, some of them. And I think that it's just too raw.
But is it because it's in your own home, you have the book, you have the and you're not at the site? Is it too much to be at the site? It's too raw. Your empathy wouldn't allow you to have that experience, yet you can consume it in media in your own home. Is that perhaps it?
I know somebody who was killed at Port Arthur. My niece's uncle, he was killed there, and his wife. And I went there, and I did go to the places where they were killed, and it wasn't about, nobody took me on a tour as such, but I did want to know, and for some people it could be closure. It could just some sort of closure of going, okay, it's real, because when you lose a loved one in that sort of situation, you kind of need to go and see. For some people, for me it was, I sort of go, okay, so where was this? Why did it happen? Where was it? And maybe it was a bit of closure. I don't know. And it was connected. Same with the Bali bombings. A friend of mine got killed in the Bali bombings. And for me, it was like I saw her in Queensland and, she was having a baby, and then all of a sudden she was gone. And just because she went out in a nightclub sort of thing. So I think for me it would be too much to go to Bali and go on a tour in making, light of it. And for me, because I think it's too raw, way too raw.
Is it because we feel these sites are sacred, yet the interpretation and the reimagining of these stories isn't seen as sacred?
Port Arthur's such an interesting layer, isn't it? Because you've got a ghost tour and then you've got a massacre, and it's fine to talk about convict history and ghost tours, but we do not talk about the massacre. Too soon.
But I think with a lot of true crime, it's presented in a way that you can actually remove yourself from the idea of it being true. It's definitely true crime, but if you think about the really successful podcasts and the successful documentaries, they're presented almost like a film or a radio play or things like that. So I think that being at the site feels different to just listening to this. That's just similar to watching something else on television. And I think sometimes we need that removal to be able to stomach these, horrific things. It's, yes, we know it happened in one sense, but there's that distancing, I think, that you get from media that you don't from the actual site.
I went into Snowtown just with the family and I was freaked out by the place, like absolutely freaked out. But I think I actually would have gone to the place that it happened to want to visualise what happened in here and why. I don't know if you've been to Snowtown, it's a tiny little place.
I was out there with the selfie stick, yeah.
Do you know what actually all of it? It's got like this big, I think it's from a wind turbine. Oh no, what is it? It's just something out there and that's it. And for me, I was sort of trying to visualise, is it in that building, is it that building? I didn't even know I was coming into the town, but I was freaked out by the place. But I wish there was probably not so much a dark tourism, but somebody to interpret what happened here and why, and how do the people now feel about this place? I mean, they have to live here. You've got tourists coming in, taking selfies in Snowtown because they've been to Snowtown, but maybe we need to unpack that for our own selves as well. I don't know.
The capitalist in me saw the bank at Snowtown. It saw people going past taking selfies out. I'm like, man, buy that, turn that into the Serial Killer Museum of Australia, and you make so much cash.
The selfie thing's interesting in itself because there's a lot of, it's okay to go and visit a place, but you can't take a photo of yourself in that place. And what is it that we see as our, as human beings, that you can go, but you can't document it. You can't document being there. And I think it's really interesting. What's the difference between having a photo there or just being there?
Being there. Can I say something very controversial? I know I live in Ballarat and you might not want to speak to me ever again. What I can see is we have a beautiful museum, outdoor museum, and it tells a really kind of fluffy idea of Wadawurrung people being here. And for me, that kind of grinds my gears in a way because I'm going, the goldfields did not look like that for Aboriginal people at all times. I mean, we had people that had craniums of Aboriginal people on the front of their tents because they were killing them at such rapid rates that they were trophies. And so, we do have this multi-million-dollar museum being, I'm not going to say the name, but I'm sure you know which one it is, in Ballarat. But, now you've got kind of a Wadawurrung story. They're putting a cultural precinct in there. And it's like, come and put a little possum skin cloak on and this is going to be all wonderful. And I was like, no, I want to have blood on the Southern Cross. Kind of, this is what the frontier wars are. These are all the wars that happen between, the Aboriginal people and the non-Aboriginal people. And this is actually what happened. I mean, we've got a sound and light show here. Why is there not an Aboriginal one? Instead of saying, but everything's lovely with Wadawurrung. It's like, no, it actually wasn't.
Well, you're talking about Sovereign Hill.
No, I am not.
But that criticism could be applied to us or any cultural institution that tells a story of Ballarat. And I think, and we were getting at it before, how do we bring your voice into that? The importance of truth telling and bringing in stakeholders, significant stakeholders, to actually be part of the institution rather than just dipping in and dipping out. And I absolutely understand your concerns there. Perhaps there's an opportunity to go in there and help steer the project in a different direction, because I certainly know that they're passionate and committed about telling the story, and I'm sure you would recognise that. But it's about how those voices are brought into that conversation, I guess. Yeah,
that's it. They're trying to do what they can, and they are working with my family here anyway. But for me, I'm going, let's tell the actual story. Even Lake Wendouree, that was a corroboree ground for us. It was a big camping ground, and it could be a beautiful story around us camping there at Lake Wendouree. It was a swamp, just saying, built.
Well, the name of this session is tourism, darker histories.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way to conclude it, because we often do gloss over the dark histories. We might enjoy dark tourism, and that's a great way to tell stories, but those darker histories are often buried underneath the surface, and certainly Indigenous stories are buried underneath the surface of Ballarat's beautiful heritage streetscapes and our stories of, enterprising immigrants and the Eureka Stockade. So, very much appreciate you sharing that in such a passionate way, because I know it's a difficult thing to talk about.
Let's just bring back Ballarat with a double A, just saying. Ballarat is a Wadawurrung word, Wadawurrung language, resting place, Ballarat. Bring back the double A.
Could be an easy win, couldn't it, really?
It would be a little bit.
All right, well, thank you very much to our panellists, Bonnie, Tara and Nathaniel. And thank you everyone for being with us today, and I hope you can stay in touch. We've got lots of great things at Eureka Centre, so we hope to see you very soon. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Steve.
Wonderful.